Now we're going to go through the process of creating a pin. So our work is going to start on the back end. Remember that within typedefs we need to add the name and arguments for any query or mutation that we want to execute. So we'll go all the way back to our typedefs file and we'll add a new root type called mutation. And this is going to have our first mutation, create pin. Now we can pass arguments through, or we can define any arguments between a set of parentheses. And the way that we're going to organize our arguments is with the help of a special object called an input. So for the arguments, we'll accept an input, and the name of this input will be for the create pin mutation. So we're going to call this create pin input. And in order to execute this mutation only if all of the arguments are available, we can add an exclamation point saying that this input and all of its values are required. And what create pin is going to return to us is the created pin. So it's going to return some data of type pin. And to create an input, to declare all of our arguments, we're going to use the input keyword and then provide the name create pin input. And the first argument that needs to be provided is the title of the pin, and this will be of type string, the image, which will be of type string, content of type string, as well as the latitude, which will be a float, and longitude, which will be a float. Now we need to head to our resolvers and create a new area in the object that we're exporting. We'll create a mutation object, provide the name of our resolver, create pin, and this resolver function, just like any other, is going to get access to root args and context. So in order to create a new pin, we're going to need the pin model. So we'll, up at the top, require the pin model from /models/pin. And note that we could also provide this model by including it in our server.js file and passing it through context, but the approach that we're taking is acceptable as well. I'm going to remove finally this dummy user object that we were using previously. Then to create a new pin, we'll need to make this an async function and await new pin. And to provide all of the input values, we can take from the args object args.input. So input itself is an object, and it's the only argument provided on our args object. But instead of providing all of the input values this way, we're going to pass in an object, spread in all of the properties of args.input, because in order to create a new pin, we're also going to need to add the author. We're going to need to add the author ID, and we're going to need to get that from the current user value in context. So to provide that to this resolver, we're going to need to wrap this resolver function in authenticated. So now we can read from context.currentUser, and remember that for author we're putting the user's ID on this field, on this property, and then populating it. So we'll create our new pin and put it in a variable called new pin. We will use the save method to persist this new pin to our database. And then to populate our pin, we can await pin.populate, and this is capital P pin. We're using our pin model for this, where we can pass in the document that we want to populate, which is the new pin document that was just created. And in particular, we want to populate the author field. So then we'll put this return value in a new variable called pin added, and we're going to return pin added from our resolver function. So heading back to our client, we need to figure out how to execute this mutation on the client, and we'll do that by going to first our GraphQL folder, to this mutations.js file, and we'll write out what we'll call our create pin mutation. This is also something that you can do within your GraphQL playground. we're going to export const a variable called create pin mutation, and we'll put it between a set of backticks. So to write our mutation, we'll first include the mutation keyword, and we need to pass in all of the values to this mutation that the mutation needs as variables. So we can declare variables in GraphQL with this $sign syntax. And first we need to reference what each of these variables types are. So our title variable, which will hold the title value, will be of type string. The image variable will be of type string. The content variable of type string. Latitude will be of type float, and longitude will be of type float. And all of these values must be provided, so we'll add exclamation points after each of these types to make sure that they're there, otherwise we'll get an error. We'll open up a set of curly braces, then write the name of our mutation, which has to match our type defs. We called it create pin, and it takes an input. So we'll provide our input argument, which again is an object, where title, the title value will be set to title, image set to the value stored in the image variable, content set to content, latitude, and longitude. Then for the values that we want to return, from this newly created pin, we can grab ID, created at, title, image, content, latitude, longitude, and then our populated author. So author will have now a set of subfields, and from it we can get the author's ID, name, email, and picture. Now to execute this mutation, we'll head back to create pin. First of all, we'll need to import our create pin mutation, import that variable, and that will be from //GraphQL/mutations. We'll need to import and create a new GraphQL client from GraphQL request. We'll create our client, we'll instantiate our client within handle submit. So we'll say new GraphQL client, pass in our endpoint localhost 4000/GraphQL, add a config object, add headers, and our authorization header is going to be set to our ID token. But how do we get our ID token here within the client? We can get it from the window, from the property window.gapi.auth2.getAuthInstance, so we can get information about our currently authenticated user, .currentUser.getAuthResponse, which is a method, .id_token. I know this is incredibly long, but make sure your code looks exactly like this, and the return value will be put in a variable called ID token, which we'll put on our authorization header. We'll put our created GraphQL client in this client variable, and then once we have our client, we can await client.request. We'll pass in our create pin mutation variable. Then to provide our variables to our mutation that we wrote out, we need to add a variables object. So we'll say const variables equals an object where title is set to the title value that we have stored in state. Image is set to the created URL from handle image upload. So make sure that we're getting that URL when we call handle image upload before we create this variables object. Content from our content variable, And then in order to get our latitude and longitude for the pin, we need to destructure from what's returned from useContext state, and then we can destructure from the state object latitude and longitude and pass those in to our variables object. We can remove the console log. Instead, now from our request we'll get a data object, but we can immediately destructure this data object and just get back our data within the name of the mutation, which is create pin. After which we can console log that. We can say pin created, and then log create pin. And finally, we'll add one more piece of state, a submitting piece of state, and we'll use this piece of state to disable our button when our mutation is in flight, so it can't be submitted multiple times. So we'll use state, set it initially to false, and we'll get back submitting and set submitting. So right after we execute handle submit, we will set submitting to true, and to set up some error handling here, we'll add a try catch. We'll add everything that we just wrote within the try part, and we'll catch any errors, and if there is an error, we will set submitting back to its initial value of false, and we'll console error creating pin and pass through the error that we got. And then finally we'll head down to our submit button and we'll add another condition for disabled, where we will say or submitting, meaning if submitting is set to true and our mutation is being executed, our submit button is also going to be disabled. And I believe I made one small mistake. Instead of grabbing latitude and longitude from just state, it needs to be state.draft. It needs to come from our draft pin. We've added a lot of code on the front end and back end. However, one last thing that we want to do when we create a pin is that we want to clear out the part of state that we set for draft. We want to clear out the draft pin since we're turning that into a pin that we're persisting in our database. So right after we create our pin, we'll execute handle delete draft, and that's going to set state.draft to null. So let's save all of our files, and we'll make sure that we don't have any errors in either of our consoles, in either of our terminals. And let's test this out. Let's try adding a new pin, adding a title, visit to Berlin Cathedral, add an image, and for some content, I'm just going to add some lorem ipsum. I'll copy that and paste it into content, and we'll take a look at our terminal. We'll hit submit, and it looks like our pin was created. Now we won't see it on our map just yet. However, we're getting a response, and for the pin data, we have an ID, the titles provided, the latitude and longitude of where we clicked, the image that I just uploaded, when it was created as a timestamp, and then all of the author information. So in the next step, we'll take care of, whenever we create a new pin, putting the pin data on our map itself.